Winter had come too early that year. October still had blood in its leaves, but the wind over the high plains was already biting mean as a dog kicked too many times. Snow had not yet fallen, but the clouds were threatening it. You could smell the ice waiting in them. It was 1924 in a part of Montana where the trees leaned east from too much wind, and the only thing that seemed to grow easy was silence. The girl came walking up the rutted road with nothing in her hands and everything on her shoulders. Her coat was torn at one side, her shoes muddy and too thin, and behind her trailed 8 children like loose fence wire, snagging and stumbling and too tired to cry. The youngest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 3, clung to her skirt like a kitten to its mother. The oldest, a girl of about 12, had the same hard-set jaw as her mother, and the same kind of silence that speaks louder than pleading. They hadn't eaten since yesterday, or maybe the day before. She wasn't sure anymore. Her thoughts had thinned out like the wind, sharp and aimless. When they reached the gate of the ranch, she stopped. She looked at the house. 2 stories. White paint gone to gray. Smoke from the chimney. A barn to the left. Corrals farther off. Horses. Fencing. Windmill. The shape of a man near the barn working with a pitchfork. Her mouth was cracked. Her legs ached clear up to her hips. But worse than all that was the hollowness in her chest, the kind that came from knowing there was no one left to ask. She didn't plan to speak. She didn't think she could, but she did. "I can work for it," she said, voice low but steady. The man by the barn looked up. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old. Mid-40s, maybe. His face was weathered dark with sun-jaw covered in stubble. He didn't answer right away. Just watched her, then the kids, then the worn bag slung across her back. He set the pitchfork aside and came closer. Not quickly, like a man who knew the world didn't reward haste. When he got near, he looked at her again. Really looked. The wind caught her hair and lifted it, showing a bruise beneath one eye. Old but not faded. "I can work for it," she said again. "Food. Just food." He glanced at the children. The littlest was shivering. The girl at her side had a bloody scrape on her shin, dried over now. "You already have," he said. She looked at him like she didn't understand. Maybe she didn't. He nodded toward the porch. "Take 'em in. Stove's hot." Still she didn't move. "I got some stew left from breakfast," he said. "Ain't much, but it's warm. Cornbread, too." She tried to thank him, but her voice caught. The oldest girl took the youngest boy's hand and started for the house without waiting. The others followed like birds who had finally seen a place to land. She stayed behind. He didn't press her. "You got a name?" he asked. She nodded. "Clara." "Clara," he said, tasting it like it might tell him something. "Name's Eli." She nodded again. "You got a man?" "Had." That was all she said. It was enough. He stepped aside. She started walking, knees shaking, dirt crumbling from her hem. He watched until the door opened and shut behind her. Then he turned back to the barn. The wind blew colder. The hills stayed silent. No one saw the way her shoulders dropped the weight a little. No one saw the tears that didn't fall. Only the wind. The kitchen was warm in the old way, not just from the stove, but from the smells that still lingered: wood smoke, lard, something cooked slow and heavy. The kind of warmth that seeps into skin and soul if you let it. Clara stood just inside the door, hand on the frame, like she needed something to hold her up. The children had already taken to the heat, peeling off threadbare coats and settling quiet around the table like they'd learned not to ask but knew how to wait. Ellie wasn't in the room. She could hear him outside again, moving hay or tending the horses. She didn't know what kind of man he was yet, just that he hadn't looked away. On the stovetop sat a blackened pot half full of stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, maybe bits of beef. A pan of cornbread sat covered with a towel. The older girl, Ruth, looked at her mother for permission. Clara gave a nod. It wasn't a feast, but for 8 children and a mother who hadn't eaten in too long, it may as well have been gold. Clara waited until they had eaten first. She took the smallest bite later. Her stomach growled like it had forgotten what food was. By nightfall, Eli had brought out wool blankets and set up a space in the sitting room. The house had 4 rooms, not counting the kitchen, and only 1 bed not in use. Clara offered to sleep on the floor. He didn't argue. The first night the silence between them was large and not unfriendly, like the space between 2 strangers at a train station. She watched the shadows from the stove flicker along the walls, listened to the children breathing. She did not cry. The next morning she was up before the sun. She found a pump behind the house and washed with ice water in a tin basin, biting her lip until it bled from the cold. She gathered the children's clothes and found a washtub, set it near the stove, and started to scrub. Eli came in and watched her a while before speaking. "You don't have to." "I do," she said. He nodded once. He asked no more questions, but the silence between them shifted just a little. By the 3rd day, Clara had found her way around his kitchen like it had once been hers. She baked biscuits without measuring, boiled beans with onion skin and salt, even patched a curtain in the corner window without being asked. The children stopped flinching at loud sounds. Ruth smiled once when Eli let her brush the gray gelding in the south paddock. The boy with the limp David stood straighter. Clara saw it all but didn't speak of it. Eli was a quiet man, but his hands were sure. He mended tacks, set a fence post with a level eye, ran the ranch without waste or noise. He didn't speak of a wife, though. A woman's coat still hung in the back room, and there was a child's book on a shelf, with the name Annie written in careful pencil. Clara didn't ask, but sometimes she caught him watching her when she wasn't looking. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, she was sitting on the porch sipping coffee made too strong. Ellie joined her. They sat without talking for a long while. The sky was clear, stars thick as dust, the moon low and hard-edged. He said finally, "Where were you headed?" She didn't answer at first. "Didn't know," she said. "Just away." He nodded as if that made more sense than any plan could. He didn't press her about the man she'd left behind. She didn't offer. But she said after a while he was a preacher. Eli looked sideways at her. She smiled without humor, said God told him he could take what he wanted as long as he said sorry after. Ellie didn't smile, didn't flinch. "Didn't start that way," she added. "Started sweet, quoting scripture and giving out pies. Just turned mean when the crowds stopped coming." He let out a breath long and low. "You run from him." "No. He left. Some revival in Nebraska. Said I was holding him back." Her voice cracked just once. "Took the last horse and the money jar. Left me the wagon and the children." Eli didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "You're not the one who ran." She turned to look at him and he looked back. Something passed between them. Not kindness exactly. Recognition. He stood after a while. "Plenty of fence down from last week's storm. If you're still aiming to work, I could use the help." "I can do it," she said. He paused. "You already are. If this story held you, subscribe for the ones ahead." The sun came up slow the next morning, bleeding light over the butters and sagebrush like something wounded. Clara had her sleeves rolled by first light, hammer in hand, helping Eli mend fence along the northern stretch where the posts leaned from wind and time. The frost had crusted over the grass and every breath was smoke. She worked through it, palms blistering, shoulders aching, hands too small for the wire stretchers. But she didn't stop. She didn't ask for anything easier. Eli watched her from the corner of his eye. He offered her gloves, which she took without a word. He didn't offer to take over. That too she noticed. By midday, Her hands were raw, but her back was straighter than it had been in weeks. The cold had worked its way out, and there was heat rising from the land, now slow and grudging. She leaned against a cedar post and let the silence settle. Eli wiped his brow with his sleeve. "You learned this work before." She shook her head. "Learned everything the hard way." He nodded like that made sense. They shared lunch under the sky bread she had baked that morning and hard cheese he'd brought out in a sack. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs from a dented thermos. They ate in silence again. It wasn't awkward. It had the feel of something that didn't need explaining. After they finished, she handed back the mug and said, "Why'd you say I'd already worked for it?" Eli looked off toward the hills like the answer was buried out there somewhere. Then he said, "Takes grit to show up empty-handed and still offer something. Most folks ask. You didn't." Clara looked down at her boots caked in dust and old blood from blisters. "Besides," he added, "those kids of yours, they didn't get that strong by accident. Someone kept them going." She didn't reply. Her throat was tight. He stood and reached for the next coil of wire. "You're not weak, Clara. Just worn." That stayed with her the rest of the day. That evening she found the sewing box in the back closet and started stitching the children's sleeves and hems by lantern light. Ruth helped her fingers small but steady. David had learned the chores fast and fed the hens without being told. The little one slept hard now, full and warm, no longer waking with nightmares. Eli fixed the hinge on the cellar door, sharpened the knives, sat quiet after supper cleaning a bridle in the corner of the room while Clara read aloud to the children from an old Bible missing half the cover. The words weren't meant for comfort, not the way she read them. They were stories of deserts and war and long suffering, of wilderness, the kind of scripture that didn't offer easy hope, only endurance. When she finished, Eli stood. He looked at her steady. "You can stay," he said. "Past winter if you want." She opened her mouth, then shut it. "It's not charity," he added. "It's help. I need it." "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." She stood too. Her hands shook a little. "What if he comes back?" Ellie's jaw clenched. "Then we handle it." She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" she asked. He didn't flinch. "Because someone should help my wife." That silenced her, not with pain but with understanding. She didn't ask about his wife. Not yet. But she saw now the way he looked at the empty chair across from his own at supper, the way he never went near the piano in the front room. Something was broken in him, same as her, but it hadn't ruined him. It had sharpened him instead, like a knife ground down to its truth. That night she stepped outside while the children slept. The stars were burning above the hills, fierce and white. She breathed deep, filling her chest with cold air, and let it out slow. Inside, Eli was still awake. She could feel it. Neither of them said it, but something had shifted. Not love. Not yet. But something quieter, like the sound of boots on earth, like the smell of bread baking in a house that had forgotten what that was. The weeks turned cold and then colder. Snow came one night after supper, silent, steady, unannounced. By morning the hills were blanketed white, and the children pressed their noses to the window like they'd never seen it before. Eli had already gone out to the barn. He moved through the snow like a man born to its shoulders, squared head down, no hesitation. Clara watched him from the porch, arms crossed tight against her chest. He didn't look back. She'd taken to rising before him. Had coffee on the stove, biscuits, rising coals, stirred hot before first light. The rhythm suited her. Work made sense where words did not. By mid-December the children had settled into the place like it was theirs. Ruth helped Clara every morning, washing, folding, sweeping. David shadowed Eli, learned to muck stalls, carry feed patch harness. The littler ones made up games in the barn loft and whispered stories to the old hound who had taken a liking to them. Clara felt the warmth come back into her hands first, then her voice. She hummed sometimes without realizing it, low and quiet, while she stirred beans or bent over mending. The kind of sound a woman makes when she's forgotten she used to be afraid. Ellie noticed. He never said much, but he stood closer now, watched longer, spoke her name like he meant it. One evening after supper he stayed at the table long after the children had gone off to sleep. Clara was drying the plates. "Annie would like you," he said. She turned, slowly. "My daughter." She didn't speak, just waited. She died 2 winters back. Fever took her fast. My wife didn't come back from it. Not really. She stayed a little while, then he trailed off. Took the train east and stopped writing before spring. Clara sat across from him. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "I used to dream of their voices. Now I just hope I don't forget what they sounded like." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her fingers were rough, same as his. "You won't?" she said. They stayed like that a long time. Nothing hurried. Nothing promised. The snow outside thickened. The world hushed itself. That night Clara dreamed of water, clear and moving fast, cutting through a dry canyon. When she woke, her cheeks were wet. After the new year, Ellie began teaching her how to ride. She hadn't been on a horse since she was a girl, and even then barely. But she took to it fast, despite a few hard landings. "You sit it better than most boys I've hired," he said one morning, watching her guide the chestnut mare around the pen. "Maybe I've just been bucked off more times," she said. He smiled, and she found herself smiling back before she meant to. They worked side by side most days now, fixing the roof on the feed shed, cutting kindling, breaking ice in the water troughs. She'd learned the lay of the land, could find the cattle in the outer pastures without asking. He trusted her with the dogs, with the tools, with the accounts. One night he handed her the ledger book. "You're better at numbers than me." She didn't say no. She sat down at the table and opened it, pencil in hand. It was the first time someone had handed her something and said, "I believe you can. Not just survive, not just endure, but carry something that mattered." Clara didn't talk about the preacher. Not often. Not in front of the children. But sometimes, when the fire was low and the house was still, she would tell Eli pieces. How he turned praise into punishment. How he'd read her verses with one hand on the good book and the other in rage. How even kindness had begun to feel dangerous. Eli never interrupted. Never offered sermons or solutions. Once he said, "You walked through hell and came out holding 8 lives in your arms." "That's not weakness, Clara." She looked at him, eyes bright. "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to feel it," he said. "You just have to keep going." She reached for his hand then, without thinking. He didn't pull away. Outside, the wind sighed across the white fields. Inside, their silence was full of something new. March brought thaw, but not warmth. The snow melted in streaks, leaving behind mud and the stench of what winter had hidden, rotted fence posts, sunken places in the pasture bones of a calf lost early in the storm. It was an ugly kind of spring, the kind you had to push through before beauty came. Clara worked harder than ever, driven not by fear now, but something quieter, something like purpose. One morning, while mending a gate out by the west fence line, she heard a voice she hadn't heard in nearly a year. "Well, I'll be." She froze. The wire cutters dropped from her hand. He was leaning on the fence like he'd built it. Same pressed coat, though the sleeves were worn now. Same silver cross at his collar, glinting in the light. His hat was clean, his face thinner, but the smirk hadn't changed. "Wasn't sure it was you at first. Thought maybe I'd seen a ghost." He laughed low and smooth. Clara didn't speak. She stood still, hands curled into fists in her coat pockets. 8 children, no wagon, living off another man's table, he went on. That what the Lord had in mind for you. She stepped back. He moved closer. I came to fetch you. She shook her head. He tilted his chin. You belong to me. No, she said, her voice dry and clear. I don't. You made vows, he said. You broke them. He reached for her arm, and then he stopped. Eli stood 10 feet behind him, shotgun resting easy in his hands. Let go, Eli said, voice low. The preacher turned, smiled. I don't mean trouble. You already brought it, Ellie replied. Clara stepped away, steady now. She moved beside Eli, not behind him. The preacher looked at her again, eyes narrowing. You think this is better than what you had a ranch hand's kitchen, freezing your bones in a shed while he pretends to care? Eli raised the barrel, not quite aiming, but close enough. She told you no, he said. The preacher looked between them. You think you've won something here, he hissed. She'll run from you too. She don't know how to stay. Clara's voice cut in. I stayed with you for too long. The wind had gone sharp again. The preacher looked down the road, calculating. Ellie didn't speak again. Eventually the preacher lifted his hands, slow and performative, and stepped back from the fence. I'll be back, he said. No, Clara answered. You won't. He watched her eyes slitted, like he was memorizing the way her mouth had formed the words. Then he turned, climbed into a wagon waiting in the distance, and left. The wind picked up, carried dust across the field. Eli lowered the shotgun. Clara let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her ribs. She turned to him. You didn't need to. I did, he said. She touched her temple as if the whole world were spinning. I thought I'd never see him again. Some ghosts find their way back, Ellie said. But that don't mean they belong here. They walked back to the house in silence. The children were still in the barn, unaware. When Clara sat down at the table, her hands trembled for the first time in weeks. Eli poured her coffee, sat down across from her. I'm not afraid of him, she said. He nodded. But I'm tired of fighting. You're not alone in it now. That evening they ate in near silence. The younger children sensed something and kept their voices low. Ruth sat near Clara, watching her with wide, worried eyes. After they were in bed, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, moon high. The preacher was gone, but the fear he'd stirred had not yet settled. Eli joined her. You still thinking of leaving, he asked. She shook her head. I just don't want to be the reason trouble comes. You're not, he said. He is, and he's not staying. She looked at him. You sure? I've seen men like him, Ellie said. Hollow down to the spine. They bluff loud because there's nothing behind them. He turned toward her. But you, Clara, you're all grit and blood and bones. You've built something here. Don't let him tear it down. She stepped closer. Her voice was soft. I don't know what this is between us, but it's the first thing that's felt real in a long time. He didn't say anything, just reached for her hand and held it. Not tightly, not like the preacher had, but steady, like a man holding something worth keeping. The days passed without a sign of the preacher, but the air had changed. Clara felt it in her bones, like a storm had brushed past without breaking, but still left something unsettled behind. She didn't speak of it again. Not to Eli, not to Ruth. But every sound outside the window pulled her eyes. Every hoofbeat made her heart twitch. Still, she rose before the sun. She scrubbed floors, baked bread, taught the children their letters. She carried on, because she knew now that love, if it was going to mean anything, had to be chosen each day, not just felt. One afternoon, while hauling feed to the barn, Eli paused by the wagon she'd arrived in. It sat beside the shed now, mostly unused wheels sagging in the ruts. Her bag was still tied beneath the seat, wrapped in oilcloth. "You still keeping it packed?" he asked, quiet. Clara came to stand beside him. She didn't look at the wagon. "For a while I needed to know I could leave," she said. "That if things turned I wouldn't be trapped again." He nodded, not hurt, not surprised. "Just honest." "And now?" he asked. She glanced at him, then out toward the far pasture where David was chasing one of the dogs, his laughter light and high and free. "Now I don't look at it much." Ellie leaned against the side of the barn, arms folded. "I'd like to take it apart if you're sure." She looked at the wagon, then really looked at it. The splintered boards, the memories clinging to it like dust. The nights spent curled up beside children with nothing to feed them. The long road behind. "All right," she said. He didn't move, just nodded again. They stood there side by side in the afternoon light, shadows long behind them. Later that week she came in from the barn to find Ruth sitting quiet at the table, lips pressed tight. Clara saw the envelope in her hand before she saw her face. "Where'd you get that?" Ruth didn't speak. Clara stepped closer. The letter had no return address. The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. "You opened it." Ruth looked up then, eyes wet but stubborn. "He said we'd all go to hell. Said you were a whore." Clara's stomach turned. "He lied," she said gently. Ruth's voice cracked. "He said we were better when we followed the Lord." Clara sat beside her. "You remember when he made you kneel outside for hours in the rain?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Did that feel like love?" "No." "Then it wasn't the Lord," Clara said. "That was just a man who used his name to make himself powerful." Ruth started to cry then, for real. Clara pulled her into her arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have left sooner. I should have protected you better." "You did," Ruth said, muffled against her shoulder. "You saved us." That night Clara sat on the porch with Eli, the letter in her pocket. "He's trying to scare her now," she said. Ellie's face darkened. "He won't stop." Clara nodded. "I don't think he knows how." "What do you want to do?" She looked out over the dark fields, moonlight silvering the grass. "I want him gone," she said. "Not just from here. From our lives." Eli didn't speak for a long while. Then he said, "You think we should go to the sheriff?" "I think we have to." "You ready to tell the whole truth?" She hesitated. Not from fear of the law, but from fear of opening the wounds all the way. But she thought of Ruth, of the younger children, of the way they'd flinched at raised voices for months, of the scar on David's shoulder from a broken belt buckle. "Yes," she said. "I am." Eli nodded. "We'll go tomorrow," he said. She looked at him then, eyes full of something tired and strong. "You don't have to come." "I know," he said. "But I will." Inside the house was warm. The children were sleeping. The fire burned low and steady in the hearth. And on the porch Clara and Eli sat close together, not touching, not speaking, but bound by something that didn't need a name, something earned, something true. The sheriff's office was a one-room square with thin walls and a wood stove that couldn't keep up with the March wind. Eli tied the team out front while Clara stood just inside the doorway, coat buttoned to the neck, Ruth's letter folded in her hand. Sheriff McAllister looked up from his desk. He was near 60, with a belly that hung over his belt and eyes that had seen too much but forgot little. He removed his spectacles slowly, like he already knew what kind of story was coming. "You want to sit?" he asked. Clara shook her head. She couldn't sit. "Not yet." Eli stood near the door, close but not shielding her. She didn't want to be shielded anymore. "I've come to report a man," she said, voice level. "James Lewin. He calls himself a preacher." McAllister leaned back. "That name's familiar." He used to ride through the revival circuit, Dakota Territory, some in Nebraska, then up this way. Says he's spreading the gospel. And what's he done? Clara unfolded the letter, laid it on the desk like evidence. Threatened me. Threatened my daughter. Came to the ranch without invitation. Put his hands on me. The sheriff read slowly, lips moving just a little. Then he looked up. You want charges filed. I want it on record. I want him warned. And I want you to know if something happens to me or my children, it starts with him. McAllister nodded. Anyone else seen him? Eli did. The sheriff turned. That true? Eli nodded once. He's not just talk. He's angry. And cornered. McAllister scratched his jaw. He's got no property here. No congregation. Nothing to keep him around. Clara's hands were clenched at her sides. He don't need roots to do damage. There was a pause. Then the sheriff said, I'll send a wire down to Fort Carson. If he comes back, we'll take him in. I can't promise much without a judge, but I'll make it known he's not welcome. Clara nodded slow. It wasn't justice, but it was a beginning. On the ride back, she was quiet. Eli didn't press. Halfway home, with the horses stepping steady through mud-slick roads, she said, I used to think if I told the truth out loud, something awful would happen. That saying it would make it worse. Eli kept his eyes forward. And now, I feel lighter. Not free, but like I set something down. He gave a small nod. Truth's like that. Heavy when you carry it alone. When they pulled up to the ranch, Ruth came running. She didn't speak, just looked at Clara's face, searching for some sign of what had changed. Clara reached for her hand. It's done, she said. Ruth held tight to her fingers. Inside, the children had drawn pictures, chalk on paper scraps, stick figures, and scribbled horses, something that looked like Eli holding a chicken. Clara laughed when she saw it. A real laugh. Surprised and bright. Eli smiled, watching her. Later that evening, after supper, they sat by the stove, not touching, just close. Clara said, Do you ever think about starting over? All the time. With someone new. He looked at her, long enough that she had to glance away. I think about it with you, he said. She didn't answer. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But I won't ask. Not until you say you want it. Clara folded her hands in her lap. I've spent my whole life giving parts of myself away to men who didn't know what to do with them. He nodded. But you've waited. You've let me become someone again. Eli's voice was soft. You were already someone. I just saw it. She blinked slow, then leaned over and kissed him. Just once. Barely there. When she pulled back, he didn't move, didn't press for more, just took her hand in his and held it between his own, warming her fingers like something precious. She didn't cry, but her eyes were full. Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, the quiet held them like shelter. And for the first time in a long time, Clara didn't feel like she was waiting to run. She felt like maybe she'd already arrived. The thaw deepened. Earth softened. Birds returned. Patches of green crept along the fence lines where snow had once stood like a wall. The days stretched longer, and the smell of manure and wet wood filled the air. Spring wasn't gentle. It came noisy and wild, as if nature had to claw its way back from sleep. Clara took to the land like she was being stitched into it. She knew the way the wind bent the grass near the creek bed. Knew which trees the crows favored, which of the heifers limped, and how to quiet the skittish mare Ellie had near given up on. She did not ask if she belonged. She worked like someone who knew the answer already. Eli, too, had changed, though he didn't say so. He laughed more, not loud, but from deep in the chest. He asked the children questions he once left alone, about books, about memories, about the way they saw the world. He let David carve his initials into the feed shed beside his own. And in the quiet spaces after chores, after supper, after the little ones had curled into sleep, he and Clara sat close, sometimes touching, sometimes not, but always together. The weight between them had shifted from grief to gravity. One morning in late April, Clara found a wrapped parcel at the kitchen table. Brown paper twine, her name written in a hand that didn't try to be fine. She untied it slow. Inside was a pair of new gloves lined with soft wool stitched neat along the fingers. For a moment she just stared at them, then looked up. Eli stood in the doorway, one boot still muddy, holding a mug of coffee. "I noticed the old ones were wearing through," he said. Her throat tightened. "I don't expect anything," he added. I wanted you to have something that was yours." She held the gloves in both hands like they might slip away if she didn't. "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek with calloused fingers. "You matter to me, Clara," he said. "Not for what you do, just for being here." She closed her eyes, breathed him in, wood smoke, leather horse. When she opened them, he was still looking at her like she was a fact, not a favor. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I wouldn't want you to be. I mean," she went on, "I'm not afraid of needing you." "Not anymore." Illy smiled. Not wide, but real. "Then let's build something," he said. She stepped into him, laid her head against his chest. Not everything had to be spoken. That afternoon they brought the children into the pasture and showed them the foundation Ely had begun marking out. A cabin, small but strong, near the cottonwoods and close to the creek. Separate from the main house, but near enough to feel together. "For you," Ely said. The children stared, confused at first. "A new house?" Ruth asked. Clara nodded. "Ours." David blinked up at her. "We're staying." She smiled and knelt. "If you want to." They did. Later, Ruth took Clara's hand while the boys ran wild between stakes and string. "You love him?" she asked, eyes searching. Clara nodded. "I do." Ruth's voice was quiet. "Does he love us?" Clara looked over to where Eli stood at pushed back, squinting into the sun, watching the children like they were something sacred. "Yes," she said. "He does." That night, Clara packed away the last of the preacher's letters, tied them with twine, placed them in the farthest drawer, and shut it. She wouldn't burn them. That wasn't her way. But they didn't belong to her anymore. She had other things to carry now, like plans, like mornings without fear, like the sound of someone calling her name without anger behind it. And when Eli took her hand before bed, rough fingers brushing hers, she held tight, not because she needed saving, but because she'd chosen to stay. The cabin rose slow, not from lack of will, but because everything was done right. Eli cut the beams himself, hauled stone from the west ridge for the hearth. Clara helped level the floor, her hands strong on the plumb line, her eyes sharper than most men he'd worked with. The children helped too, passing tools, collecting nails, stacking boards with care. It became theirs in the building of it. Not just a roof or walls, but proof that they weren't waiting anymore. They were rooted. By early summer, the frame stood clean against the sky. The scent of sawdust and fresh-cut pine clung to the air. Clara would stop sometimes, lean against a post, and just breathe. She hadn't known how much she'd needed something permanent. One morning, Eli came in from the barn, wiping sweat from his neck, and said almost too casual, "We ought to put a name on it." Clara raised an eyebrow. "The house? The whole place?" She looked at him. He was watching her, waiting. "What would you call it?" He shrugged. "I thought maybe you'd choose." She smiled. "Why me?" "Because you're the reason it's here." She thought for a long while, eyes drifting out toward the open fields, where the wheatgrass swayed soft in the breeze. "Call it Mercy Ridge," she said finally. Eli nodded like the name had been waiting all along. That night, as the sun dipped low and lit the horizon like fire, Clara stood on the cabin porch, just the bare boards not yet painted, and watched the children chase each other in the tall grass. Ruth had a wildflower tucked behind her ear. David carried a slingshot Ellie had carved from elm. The littlest one, Anna, tripped and fell, and Ruth scooped her up with ease. Inside the house, supper waited. Cornbread and beans and wild greens Clara had picked herself from the south slope. Nothing fancy, but real. Enough. Ellie came to stand beside her. "I saw the preacher," he said. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. 2 towns over. He was at a tavern drunk, nobody paying him mind. She waited. He looked like a man chasing a story he couldn't sell anymore. "I don't think he's coming back." She exhaled slow. "Still," he added, "I can take the horse to town and file a restraining petition if you want. It'd keep something on paper." Clara shook her head. "He's already behind us." Haley nodded. "You're sure?" She looked up at him. "I don't need the law to tell me I'm free." He smiled. "You never did." They stayed quiet then, just listening to the wind move through the grass. After a while, she said, "I used to think home was something you got when someone gave it to you. And now I think it's what you build with your own 2 hands." She looked up at the house. The new roof. The windows waiting for glass. The door frames square and strong. A place with no ghosts in the corners. "I don't want to wait," she said. "For what?" She turned toward him. "For you to ask." He blinked. She smiled. "I want to marry you, Ellie," she said. "If you still mean what you said." He stepped forward, held her face in both hands. "I've meant it since the day you walked up that road with nothing but fire in your eyes." She kissed him. Long, slow. A kiss without fear or apology. Later, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned down to embers, Eli pulled a small ring from his pocket. "Silver smooth, no gem." "It was my mother's," he said. "If it's too plain, I can find." "It's perfect," she whispered. She didn't cry. She didn't have to. That ring slid on like it had been waiting for her all this time. And when she lay beside him that night, her back warm against his chest, she did not dream of rivers or roads or running. She dreamed of fences, of bread baking, of a child not yet born kicking strong against her ribs. The wedding was simple. Just Clara, Eli, the children, and a neighbor couple from downriver who brought bread and a small jug of blackberry wine. They stood under the cottonwoods near the creek where the water ran clear over smooth stones and the grass bent soft in the breeze. Clara wore a dress Ruth helped mend off white, patched at the hem but clean and fitting. Eli wore his best shirt, the buttons polished and stiff with soap. His hands trembled when he held hers, not from nerves but from the weight of it all. He didn't speak loud. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just looked at her eyes steady and said the words she'd never heard spoken like that before, "I will." Clara didn't cry until David handed her a bouquet of wild prairie flowers. "We picked the ones that don't die fast," he said, like that meant something. It did. Afterward, they ate on the porch of the new cabin, the floor not yet painted, the windows half hung, everything unfinished and still perfect. The children ran barefoot in the grass. Ruth braided Anna's hair. Eli carved a wooden spoon for Clara while she leaned back in the rocking chair he'd built, one hand resting over the curve of her belly. They didn't talk much about the past anymore, not because they'd forgotten it, but because it had finally laid down its weight. Clara still had scars. So did Eli. But there was something about naming a thing, sorrow, loss, love, that stripped its power, that turned it from something hidden into something carried and then eventually into something shared. That summer, the crops came in strong. The neighbors brought tools and help when the barn roof needed patching. Ruth started a little school under the big tree with chalk and a slate board. David learned to ride and rope, Eli teaching him without words, just nods and gentle corrections. The littlest ones stopped asking if they'd have to move again. One evening, late August, Clara stood out behind the house as the sun fell behind the far hills. The light turned everything gold: fence posts, barn roof, Ellie's shoulders where he knelt planting the last row of late squash. Her ring caught the light, too dull and worn but shining in its way. The baby moved beneath her ribs. Strong. Certain. She pressed her palm there and smiled. Eli stood, dusted his hands on his pants, and walked toward her. His face in the light looked younger than it had in spring. Or maybe just lighter. He came to stand beside her, looking out over the fields. The cottonwoods shifted in the wind, whispering things neither of them needed to say out loud. "You ready?" he asked, touching her hand. "I already was," she said. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the cabin porch. No rush in their voices. Just the slow, warm quiet of people who had earned their peace. "You remember the first thing you said to me?" Eli asked. Clara smiled. "I said I could work for it." He nodded. "You did. And you said—" "I said you already had." She looked at him. "Did you mean it?" "I still do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carving, a horse, smooth and careful, no bigger than his palm. "For the baby," he said. "First thing made just for them." She held it gently. Felt the grain of the wood, the weight of it. "They're already part of this," she said. "Like you are." They sat a while longer, stars blinking out one by one above them. No fear. No need for words. Just breath. Just earth. Just love earned slow and deep like roots. Behind them the cabin stood strong. Before them the land stretched wide. And in between a life had taken shape, stitched from loss, healed by labor, steadied by kindness. It was not easy. It was not clean. But it was theirs. And it would hold.